Hi there, I'm Marina of All Correct, and it's not that rare that we are asked this question. What's the most important thing in localization of a famous IP? Well, let's see how we dealt with it while working on Space Marine 2. Space Marine 2 is one of the titles that we at All Correct have localized recently. It was developed by Saber Interactive and published by Focus Entertainment. Being one of the most anticipated and highly praised titles, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 had quite a demanding localization process in place, and the main goal of this process was to reach global audiences with that unmistakable feel of the famous IP. From coordinating the localization teams to aligning with the IP holders, the decisions had to pass through several layers of review to ensure accuracy and consistency. And we went through all this with the line producer of Focus Entertainment, Guillaume de César. So let's talk about this strategic process and creative decisions behind the scenes. It all began in January 2023. Just imagine a quiet day at the office, emails rolling in, coffee flowing, and then, ping, an invitation from Focus Entertainment to work on the multilingual localization of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. I remember myself staring at the email for a moment. Then I shared the news with the team. Excitement off the charts, but very soon the weight of what we had signed up for started to sink in. Now looking back, we know that Space Marine 2 has become Steam's most played Warhammer 40k game ever. But back then, we only started to realize what was in store for us. You see, localizing Warhammer is not just translating words, it's translating a 40,000-year-old nightmare of war, gods, heresy, and chain axes into 16 languages, all while making sure the Emperor's faithful, aka the fans, don't burn you at the stake. Did you know that Warhammer universe spans over 600 novels, dozens of games, and more lore than some actual religions? So let me ask you this, how much lore is too much lore? Because Warhammer 40k doesn't just have a lot of lore, it has an entire galaxy's worth. We're talking hundreds of novels, short stories, and source books. Just the Horus Heresy series alone spans 64 books and still growing. Video games, tabletop expansions, rulebooks, animated series, each adding more layers to the universe. And let's not forget, the timeline itself spans over 40,000 years of history, covering entire planetary exterminations, lost civilizations, and wars that make the apocalypse look like a minor inconvenience. And just in case this wasn't overwhelming enough, the Warhammer 40k wiki alone contains over 27,000 articles and weighs in at nearly 20 gigabytes of raw data. That's not just deep, it's an abyss of lore. So the challenge to localize a Warhammer title into 16 languages was accepted. But lore is built with words, right? It's inseparable from game design and player immersion, and localization is just an extension of game design. When it reflects the tone and the mechanics accurately, it preserves player immersion and delivers a consistent experience across all markets. Here's a simple example showing how word choices may affect gameplay. So the original line is, "Slay those damnable beasts." It's intense, it's an order, it carries emotion, power, and danger. Sadly, I cannot pronounce French properly, so let's have a look at the German version. So it could be, "Haut dieser blöden Monster It's way too casual. Haut is like smack them down, and blöde means silly or stupid. It's not something a Space Marine would say in a life or death fight. Now here goes the right one. Tötet diese verdammten Biester. Tötet is strong and direct and means to kill actually. Verdammten Biester means damned beasts. It sounds serious, it fits the Warhammer world. So same line, same situation, but depending on the word choices, it either feels like Warhammer or completely breaks the mood. That's the power of localization when it works hand in hand with game design. The goal of Focus Entertainment was to make sure the vision of the development team reached as many people as possible with the same quality and authenticity. That being said, there were also economic realities, and as much as Focus team would love to include Swedish dubbing, for example, in Space Marine 2, they had to make choices about which languages they could support. Focus Entertainment were very positive about some new territories, and thanks to Games Workshop's input, this was actually one of the first games they added Thai as a supported language. Thai came with its own set of technical challenges, unexpected ones to be honest. But that's how you grow, by trying new things. Finally, the success of Space Marine 2 gives the team a chance to dream even bigger for the sequel. Now let's take a quick look at the narrative objectives set by Saber Interactive. Understanding their vision is very important because if the localization doesn't match the story, the experience feels off. First, they wanted to create a game that feels 100% like Warhammer. That meant not just the story, but the atmosphere, grimdark, intense, full of scale and brutality. The environments, the combat, even the dialogues needed to feel big and dangerous, just like in the Warhammer universe. So from a localization perspective, we needed to preserve that tone in every line. And a big part of that tone comes from the main character, Lieutenant Titus. This game continues his story, but now he is changed. He is returning from the Ultramarines after his time with the Death Watch. He is respected, but also under pressure, and the story explores that. Saber wanted his journey to feel personal, conflicted, and weighty, so every word spoken or written for him needed to reflect that layered identity of a warrior, a leader, and a symbol. The story also had to feel woven into the gameplay, not just layered on top of it. Missions, environment, even mechanics were designed to reflect the narrative beats. So when we localized, we weren't just translating dialogue, we were ensuring the gameplay supported the story and vice versa. And finally, Saber didn't just build Space Marine 2 for longtime fans, they also wanted it to be accessible to newcomers. So while the story continues the arc from the very first game, it's also self-contained with enough exposition to pull new players into the universe without overwhelming them. In short, this was not just about telling a Warhammer story, it was about living it. And that narrative vision had to inform every localization decision that we made. Warhammer 40k is a very rich and complex IP that has spanned across multiple media for almost 40 years. To make sure the tone of the universe is respected and the narration stays true to the lore, Games Workshop needs to read and approve all the English texts and dialogues. Strict guidelines had to be followed to get their approval. For example, several lines had to be re-recorded because the actors pronounced lieutenant the American way, like lieutenant, instead of the British one. Now, the IP holder can't realistically be involved at that level for all languages, but they still have a way to maintain consistency. This is called IP terms validation. The idea is that we don't need to validate everything, but only the words and names that are specific to the Warhammer 40k universe. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Words like Hellbrute or Tyrannid are clearly part of the lore, but other times it's a bit more ambiguous. For example, the Emperor is a central figure in the universe, but it is also just a common noun. So do we treat it as the IP term or not? We did receive a large glossary from Games Workshop, but it's not uncommon to come across a term that's not listed. We'll see later how we have integrated this validation process into the localization workflow. Now let's talk about one of the most important yet often underestimated stakeholders, the players. From the very start, we knew that even if the publisher signed off, the development team was aligned, and the IP holder gave us the green light, it would all be meaningless if the players didn't buy into the experience, because in Warhammer 40k, the Emperor protects, but the players decide. As a localization studio, we weren't just going in blind, of course. We had already worked on other games set in the Warhammer universe, so we came in with a solid understanding of player sentiment and feedback trends. We had seen where translators failed to capture the tone, where lore terms were mishandled, and how players reacted, especially on community forums and in reviews. So with Space Marine 2, we knew exactly what we were walking into. Players don't just want translated text. They want a native experience that still sounds like Warhammer. They expect authenticity, meaning narrative that feels like it was written in their own language, but still radiates grimdark energy. They demand consistency, and many of them had read the novels, of course, played the games, maybe even painted the miniatures. And most of all, they want to feel like the game was truly made for them, and not just ported and labeled localized. And failing to meet those expectations, that's not just bad translation, that's heresy. Working with Games Workshop is part of Focus Entertainment DNA. as this collaboration already lasts for 15 years or even more. From the start, it was obvious that the translators should be familiar with the 40K universe, and that was Focus' main request to us all correct, because even for top level translators, it's hard to immediately capture the tone and depth of that universe if they are discovering it for the first time. Given the stakes of this project, Focus preferred to stick with a single localization provider that they had worked with for years. That said, it's definitely possible to work with different local providers or freelancers, but that's only possible if you have full confidence in your localization pipeline and your ability to replicate the same process multiple times. Localization on its own is already a complex process, and when you add the Games Workshop layer on top, your goal becomes simply to keep things as straightforward and efficient as possible. Even when you're fully armed with Warhammer knowledge, tone guides, and glossary prep, there's one thing we've learned from experience: perfect alignment doesn't happen in isolation. So from the very beginning, we made sure that localization was part of the development process. We built a shared environment where translators could flag unclear lines, ask about intent, or raise concerns about tone, especially in areas heavy with lore or military jargon. That translator query system became our first line of defense against confusion and misinterpretation. That alone saved us from a lot of blind guesses. And beyond the spreadsheet, we made it a point to get on calls with the development team. That's where some of the most important alignment happened. Fruitful conversations about nuance, character voice, and that unmistakable Adeptus Astartes tone. There was a moment early on where we received a wave of tonal feedback. Not because we didn't understand Warhammer, we absolutely did, but because even with all that knowledge, some expectations still had to be negotiated. This doesn't sound very military, or it feels too grounded, not ceremonial enough. This sounds more like a folktale rather than a Space Marine briefing. And honestly, that kind of feedback is gold. It shows how seriously the developers take the voice of their universe, and it opened up valuable discussions, of course, that made the final product better for everyone. Because at the end of the day, you don't just translate Warhammer, you align with it. Now let's take a look at an extract from our Space Marine 2 glossary. It will help illustrate a few interesting cases. Translations carry legacy. Maybe some terms wouldn't be translated in the same way today, but Games Workshop prioritizes consistency over potential and often subjective improvements. That said, changes do happen. A good example is the French translation of Genestealer, originally known as Genevaux, then later reverted. The Games Workshop glossary pulls from a huge mix of sources, so if you ever spot a contradiction, just ask them. Next, we have two entries for Wraithbone. Why two? And why do they have different translations? That's easy. One refers to the in-universe material, which should be translated, and the other is the paint name, which should stay in English in most languages. I mean, of course, the paint that you use to paint your miniatures. This shows why translators can't just rely on translation memories, they need context to avoid these traps. Imura is a new character created for the game. Even though it's a proper name, we added it to the glossary to keep transliteration consistent in languages like Japanese or Russian. Will Games Workshop reuse the character one day? Maybe, maybe not, but at least he is in the glossary already. To make sure Space Marine 2 would truly resonate with players around the world, Focus Entertainment team sent out a controlled batch of press copies across 8 different regions. Their main focus was Western Europe and North America, the historical strongholds of Warhammer 40K and the largest, most vocal communities. But this wasn't just a marketing tactic. It was an early warning system and a chance to listen how the game was being received before the launch. These previews helped us detect potential risks early, adapt our communication if necessary, and make sure that both gameplay and narrative were positioned in the right way for global audiences. And it didn't just stop there. Once the game was officially released, we kept our eyes peeled for real-time player feedback, especially on Steam. We even used a dedicated tool that filters and analyzes only localization-related reviews, allowing us to spot trends, detect praise or issues early, and plan for rapid adjustments in live support. In short, gathering and reacting to localization player sentiment wasn't just a one-time task for us. It was and still is a key part of our work. Now let's have a look at what expectations were there from all the involved parties and how we tackled them. First, the first stakeholder, of course, was the publisher, and their main expectation was market reach. And the perfect solution there was multilingual localization. Then comes development team, of course, and their main expectation was game design integrity. And we solved this, issue or expectation with ways to align with the team. Next comes the IP holder, and their main expectation was consistency of IP terms. And we dealt with it by constant approvals with the IP holder, of course. And last but not least, players. What expectation did they have? Of course, it's authenticity. And we tried to solve this by having early sentiment. Now we are reaching the final part of this talk, live support. So the two main pillars of this stage are careful localization pipeline management and stable and consistent localization team. So let's begin with the first. During the development, even if translation is never simple, we are not under the same pressure as after the release. Post-launch, everything speeds up. Players want new content fast, and game designers often keep tweaking things until the last minute, so localization has to stay very flexible. So far, every new update has been fully translated and dubbed in all the supported languages. To make that possible, even with tight deadlines, a very specific process was in place. So as soon as Saber finishes writing, even if it's not yet final, the script should be gone through and every new IP term has to be highlighted. Most of the time we can wait and include those in the full translation batch, but sometimes they got translated right away and then sent to Games Workshop for approval as early as possible. It's a proactive step, but it's crucial because you don't want anything unapproved ending up in the dubbing sessions, especially with this kind of timing. Another way to save time is to record English and the other dubs at once. And yes, that can really help, but it's riskier, both technically and in terms of overall quality. And one of the biggest challenges here as well is keeping your localization team stable and consistent over time. And honestly, from my side as an account manager, I'm not involved in the day-to-day production details. My role is more about overseeing the bigger picture and making sure everything runs smoothly. So when I thought about what really kept our team stable, I went straight to the person who would know best, our project manager. And her answer to my question, so how do we manage to keep the team stable, was hassle-free scheduling. Here goes my appreciation to the Focus Entertainment team, and with them it was possible to have mild deadlines. And second was very simple. Why would anybody just leave such an awesome project? Because at the end of the day, working on something like Space Marine 2, a title packed with so much lore, energy, and fan love, is not just another gig. It's a project that you want to stay on, fight for, and see through to the end.